Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, welcome back to another exciting episode of Matt Lewis and the News. Today I am joined by two of my good friends and colleagues, Will Rahn, who is at Yahoo News, and Jamie Weinstein, the host of the Jamie Weinstein Show podcast. Will Rahn and Jamie Weinstein, welcome back to the news.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Good to talk to you. And Will, what's your official title at Yahoo?
I'm a senior editor, which is one of the kind of like meaningless media titles that can mean any number of things.
It's like being a bank vice president, right?
Say that again, Jamie.
It's like being a bank vice president. It's a finance joke. I'm not sure it's going to be lost on this audience.
Yeah, but I'm an editor. I edit.
Awesome. Well, Jamie, let me start with you about this report that kind of broke overnight. We're taping this on a Friday morning at The Atlantic, where allegedly Donald Trump has talked about fallen heroes, fallen service members as being like losers. And it sounds pretty consistent with what we know about Donald Trump. But what is your take on this? Do you think he said it? Do you think it'll matter?
Well, I know it's a couple things. So I know Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, who also wrote the story. He was a guest on my podcast. There are conservatives who criticize Jeffrey Goldberg for firing Kevin Williamson after hiring him. It was a 2-day kind of arrangement, but I don't see that as a criticism, as claiming that he's, that people are trying to use that to say this is not true. I see those as non sequiturs. As a writer, I don't ever remember his work being challenged. And one interesting point I think that no one is making is that he is the editor-in-chief now. He doesn't write very much. When he does write a piece, it's really usually an interview with someone really high profile like Jim Mattis. And so the idea that if this was a some type of plot to get someone to write this story, an anti-Trump story, it seems like a strange person to go to try to do that, someone who doesn't write very much, as opposed to some maybe lower level writer somewhere who might be excited for a big break story. So I guess I do believe it, but I do think that because of a lot of stories that have broken that seemed big that turned out not to be true, that at this point you're going to need some of these names to go on the record to give it enough credibility with the general public.
Right. So these are 4 anonymous sources, but The Atlantic is obviously a respected outlet. Jeffrey Goldberg is obviously a respected journalist. Will Rahn, we worked together. The three of us worked together at the Daily Caller. You edited me at the Daily Beast. You then went to CBS, and you are now at Yahoo. What would you do as an editor if you were handed this kind of story with these explosive allegations, but a credible, very highly credible journalist who's coming to you with this story? What are we to make of this, just from a journalistic ethics standpoint?
I think as an ethical matter, to Jamie's point, I don't think there's any reason to doubt that Jeffrey Goldberg had 4 sources speaking to this. And I think when we look at the story, we kind of have to parse out some of the allegations. The opening allegation that he did not visit the cemetery for the American war dead in France, the American war dead from World War I, because it was raining and he was worried that it would affect his hair. That sounds in keeping with what we know about Donald Trump as a president and a public figure. The other stuff about calling the American war dead losers and suckers and things like that, it is one of these things that rises to a level of almost cartoonish villainy. That is something that it almost seems like an invention of like a lazy invention of a lazy screenwriter trying to write about a horrible Republican president. For it to stick, I don't know. We probably do need more verification. At least voters are probably going to want more verification. We also have to just keep in mind that in the summer of 2015, when Donald Trump called John McCain, when he insulted John McCain's service record and said that he wasn't a hero and that he liked the guys who don't get shot down, that is something that I think a lot of us predicted would hurt Donald Trump's polls in the Republican primary, and it did not. What would be interesting is if someone really credible got up and said, listen, I was a source for this story. I'm breaking the anonymity. I was there. I saw that. That's going to have more of an impact, because right now, trust in the media is low, particularly among Republicans. It's not particularly high among independents either. Some additional verification for this story may be necessary for it to really cause Donald Trump damage going into November.
And can I just jump in there real quick? I think what Will said about the cartoonish nature. When I first saw this on Twitter, someone tweet the quote, I thought they were doing maybe a satirical take on Donald Trump or something like that, because it did seem so cartoonish. But as Will mentioned, I mean, he has called soldiers who were captured, John McCain in particular, losers. The question is, and what makes this different in kind, is that people who defended Donald Trump on that, and I think a lot of us thought this would be the death nail of his nascent campaign. A lot of people said, well, what he was doing was counterpunching. He was attacking John McCain. He didn't really mean that war heroes, people that are captured, are losers. This was just a way to attack someone who attacked him. I don't know if I don't think that's a very good excuse for what he said. But what would make this different in kind is that these would be people who haven't attacked Donald Trump in any way. It would show that this is actually what he believes. And to Will's point, I do think that if John Kelly, for instance, came out and said this was true, we've all been wrong saying things would affect and hurt Donald Trump's election prospects. I do think someone like John Kelly, with his background and his credibility, would be powerful and could sway people's minds on this if it's true. Although I think a lot of Trumpers then would argue that this is another disgruntled employee by Donald Trump. But my bet is that his testimony, on the record testimony, would matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would matter. I think it would matter partly the timing of it. If James Mattis and John Kelly, for example, were to either do an interview right before the election or appear in an ad right before the election, I do think. I mean, remember, Trump only won by like 77,000 votes in 3 states, right? So it's easy to say like, oh, nothing could stop Trump. The Access Hollywood thing didn't matter. The John McCain comment didn't matter. But every little thing could matter, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think to your point, Matt, I mean, I texted you guys last night. If, John Kelly has said a few things negative about Trump, but really has mainly remained silent. If there was an ad in October, the October surprise, where, it's just him, maybe in front of a fireplace, saying, I was a general for 30 years. I lost my son in battle in Afghanistan. I worked for Donald Trump at the highest levels as his Secretary of Homeland Security and Chief of Staff. I was around him as much as anybody during that period of time. And this is what he said about the vets, about, lost soldiers. I think that would have more legs than most of this other stuff that we at one time thought would hurt Donald Trump. But maybe I'm crazy.
I'm actually writing a column about this right now. But Rahn, what do you think?
Specifically, though, he would need to verify the losers and suckers part of this, because again, we look at this piece and we kind of parse it out, and there's these different allegations within it. My favorite, the most Jeffrey Goldberg part of this, and no disrespect to him, but the line towards the top where it's talking about how Donald Trump didn't understand why the U.S. intervened in World War One, and that there's this obvious answer to this. Whereas a century later, that's an honest debate among historians
Yeah.
Right.
about whether that was a worthwhile use of American military might and American lives. There's
Yeah, no, I had historian David Petrugia on this podcast commemorating the anniversary of World War One, and he wasn't quite sure why we were involved in World War One. So I mean,
one of these, it's an open question of history. It's something that people can still disagree about. There's not an obvious answer to, I think, most people, and it would be, again, in keeping with Donald Trump to say something like that. That's not a grave allegation. The thing about his hair, again, in keeping with what we know about Donald Trump, it's the cartoon part, the sort of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons aspect of calling them suckers and losers. It reminded me of an old Simpsons gag about Mr. Burns owning a early draft of the Constitution that has the word suckers in it. It rises to the level of just very dark comedy. But I mean, again, we're going to see in the next few days. To my mind, no other outlet has confirmed this story yet.
Yes.
I think that's important. I think if the New York Times can back it up, and the Washington Post can back it up, and Yahoo News can back it up, and all these various outlets, but you need some. You do. I think this story just kind of hanging out by itself, I don't know if that's going to drive numbers really that far either way. I'm not sure how many undecided voters read The Atlantic, period.
Just to jump in, Will, that has been confirmed. It hasn't been confirmed on the record, but the AP reporter Laporta, who was a Marine himself, used to be at, I think, the Military Times, has two sources, one direct source and one indirect source, who said he heard what the president said. He doesn't specify which aspect of the story.
And this is important. And this is coming. This is coming also at a time when there was a report the other day that Trump's support among active duty military is dropping, and the Trump Pentagon, the White House, the Trump administration's Pentagon has, I guess, shuttered the Stars and Stripes magazine for the military. So this is like not just happening isolated. There are other. It's like sort of a trend happening now.
Again, I think we're just going to need more verification for a story like that and the specific things. And again, I think it is a fair question to ask that these people who were in the room with Donald Trump as he said this, and they've been granted anonymity, if they feel that strongly and they heard this and they were deeply offended, you do have to ask, and they may have good reasons, but you do have to ask why they wouldn't break the anonymity, and why wouldn't they come out and say, this was me, I told Jeffrey Goldberg this, I told the AP this, I backed this up, I was there, I saw this.
I agree. And if you
What's
saw
the reason to stay anonymous?
Yeah, and I agree. And Jeffrey Goldberg, I guess, was on CNN this morning and said they were anonymous because they didn't want to get tweeted at and stuff like that.
That's a bad reason to stay anonymous.
I agree. I think it's more than getting tweeted at, but this is kind of important if this was actually said, and these are presumably military people that are some of the sources here. I think that they faced much more threats in their life than being tweeted at. So it would be. I think someone needs to step forward now, especially since there's so many on the record denials from people around Trump that they really need these sources to go on the record.
Yeah, I want to go back to something that Will said a few minutes ago, which was he talked about the distrust that we have in the media, and I have to say, as someone who's a conservative columnist, I think some of that scrutiny is warranted. Think of Mitt Romney, a pretty decent, honorable guy, but the coverage of Mitt Romney by the media when he was running for president not that long ago, he held somebody down and gave him a haircut. He abused Seamus the dog. He never paid taxes. He was declaring a war on women. And I think I don't want to be accused of like both siderism here, but I think that the media kind of invited some of this disbelief, and it opened the door for demagogues like Trump to talk about fake news. Jamie Weinstein?
Yeah, I don't think you even have to go
What do
back.
you think?
I don't think you even have to go back that far to Mitt Romney. I mean, there are examples of the Michael Cohen in Prague story that was reported by, I believe, McClatchy, and I'm not even sure that they have taken it back yet. When it seemed very clear after the Mueller report and the Senate intelligence report, particularly the Mueller report, that didn't happen. So they haven't taken that back yet. I'm thinking of that. I don't know if you remember this story. It wasn't a huge national story, but it was indicative of a real issue where I think it was like Bloomberg Law or something. I guess one of Bloomberg's verticals. They reported that a Labor Department hire wrote anti-Semitic things on Facebook, but when you looked at what he wrote, he was actually making fun of the guy that Paul Nehlen, who was running against Paul Ryan, who was an anti-Semite. He was making fun of supporters. He was being the exact opposite of that. He was ridiculing anti-Semites, and I'm not even sure they pulled that back, or they might have minorly changed the story, but they didn't apologize for what was an obviously false report. And what made it more false is that they didn't include the context that would have made it clear. So look, the media does lots of good. Lots of stuff that we know is bad is because of great media reporting. But there is enough mistakes out there, and mistakes that weren't immediately corrected and accounted for, that gives some distrust, some legitimacy.
What do you think, Will?
I think there's what Jamie said is correct, and there's a lot of Matt Taibbi's column today speaks to this as well. That there was just kind of when it looks like the media is the opposition party, and Donald Trump is able to successfully paint the media as that, it's certainly it's certainly an issue. It's a problem, and I think most journalists would acknowledge that there's been some problems with Trump reporting, and then in the past, you're talking about that those reports about Mitt Romney and things like that. I think most reporters would say there is at least a grain of truth to the whole media bias narrative. But I'm thinking about Donald Trump, and I'm thinking about his chances come November. And I don't know if he's going to be able to just shout fake news long enough for him to survive this election. I don't think it's going to be enough for him to carry him across the finish line. Two polls that stuck out to me this week. You had in Pennsylvania, you had a Monmouth poll that showed Pennsylvania really tightening, which is very good for Trump. Joe Biden, obviously the son of Scranton, he has a lot of Pennsylvania connections that he's kept over the years. If Donald Trump is able to keep Pennsylvania in his column, it's going to make it hard for the Democrats to win in the Electoral College. But the other startling poll, the Fox News poll in Arizona that had Joe Biden up 9 against Trump, but also in the Senate race there, Mark Kelly having a 17-point lead over his Republican opponent. And that's the John McCain seat. That's Barry Goldwater's seat. This is an ancestral conservative seat. And if he has really, even if it's that poll is 10 points off, you still have Mark Kelly winning by a landslide in Arizona on election day. I mean, if I'm a Republican, I'm freaking out about Arizona in a major way right now, because you take that out of the Republican column, again, it's going to be very difficult for
Yeah.
the Republicans to make up for that. Dude, Donald Trump can win Pennsylvania, but if he loses Arizona, that could be the ball game right there.
Yeah, I would encourage everybody listening, go to 270towin.com. Start playing around with the electoral map. And if you flip Arizona, which seems pretty likely, it's bad news for Trump. I will say this, though, and I think because this ties into our last question about the media and the sort of nullification that I think conservatives are engaged in. I have a buddy who's a pretty prominent strategist in Arizona who tells me, and he tends to be honest. This is not somebody who is, spinning or carrying water. He doesn't believe those polls, and he thinks people are lying to the pollsters. That they don't believe the polls, and that they are not being honest when they're being polled. He's doing focus groups in Arizona. So I'll just throw that out there as an asterisk. He thinks it's basically a dead heat between Biden and Trump in Arizona. So I wonder if the distrust that a lot of Americans and a lot of conservatives have for the media applies to polling as well.
It's certainly possible. I mean, so in Britain, this is the shy Tory effect, they call it, that in elections, at least as most recently as David Cameron, certainly in the Thatcher years, the polls were off because it did seem that when the BBC or Channel 4 or whatever British outlet called them, they were very hesitant to announce their support for the Conservative Party there. I think I don't think anyone has exactly nailed down how many of these shy Trump voters existed in
Trump voters don't seem very shy to me, right? I mean, they don't seem like shy people.
You see these flotillas last night. You had these big rallies in Pennsylvania. A lot of Trump supporters are extremely vocal about their Trump support. But of course, it's theoretically possible that you have these people out there in swing states and areas. Sure, let's say like the Phoenix suburbs, Maricopa County, something like that. That you do have these people who are hesitant to reveal their Trump support because they just don't want the hassle, and they don't want to qualify it because they don't really have the opportunity to qualify it in all sorts of ways. You do talk to there's the very vocal, open guys with the Trump flags hanging off their boat. That's one group of Trump voters. You have a lot of Trump voters who will tell you, though, listen, I don't agree with everything he says. I don't agree with everything he does. He makes me cringe sometimes. The things that come out of his mouth are sometimes gross. I wish he would stop tweeting. I don't really think he's a good human being. However, it's a binary choice. And given that binary choice, I don't trust the left right now. I don't trust Joe Biden to rein in the left. So I'll go with Donald Trump. There's a lot of those voters out there, and they'll probably decide the election which way they go.
Yeah, let me bring in Jamie here. Let's just put aside the Atlantic story and just talking about the state of the race. Right now, we've got about 60 days to go. It's Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. It is mostly a binary choice. Jamie Weinstein, where do you see the race?
Look, obviously, the polls show that Biden has a commanding lead, but for many different reasons, I don't know. I wouldn't go and claim victory yet if I was Joe Biden's people. I think things can change. We've seen things change rapidly. The economy could form more of a V shape as we go into Election Day. There could be a drastic health. The vaccine that Donald Trump has really been pushing for could come to the fore and be big news. All sorts of things could occur. So polls show Joe Biden leading, but again, I wouldn't take comfort in that if I was Biden's campaign. I would keep pushing very hard to ensure victory on election day because one or two candidates are going to win, and I still think either one really can.
Yeah, it's weird too. I feel like when I don't know if you guys saw this weekend, but I was sort of sounding the alarm about this emerging narrative that the emerging narrative that Joe Biden hasn't done enough to speak out about the looting and the violence and the unrest in the streets in Kenosha in Portland. And I think I was warning Joe Biden and Democrats, like, hey, just be careful about this. And I got some pushback from mainstream media folk. I think that they think that I'm acting in bad faith and that I am sort of, a bedwetter or something. But I don't understand how like raising the alarms is somehow hurts Joe Biden. What's your take on that, Will Rahn?
I like to go back to just the days before the 2016 election when Nate Silver gave Donald Trump roughly a 1 in 3 chance of winning. And he was clobbered for about 48 hours from a certain section of liberal writers who said that he was just trying to drive up clicks and page views and scare Democrats into reading his site. That certainly didn't turn out to be the case, and Nate Silver's analysis seemed pretty solid when we looked at it in retrospect, because things that have a 1 in 3 chance of happening happen all the time. So we're going to see more of this before the election. There's going to be people, particularly on social media, they kind of lose their minds in the days and weeks before the election. People are freaking out. People are very nervous about this election. People aren't going to always behave rationally on Twitter, particularly now. But I mean, I think we all know that this is a warning. This could be a real problem for Democrats come November, because there's a reason we just assume that riots and lawlessness help Republican candidates. Now, there's the Rick Perlstein argument that in 1970, Republicans got clobbered in the midterms because the riots and the protests were still going on 2 years into Richard Nixon's presidency. He wasn't able to snuff them out, and Republicans got blamed for it. I think that's also plausible. That could happen. But these images of the Antifa stuff and what we saw in Kenosha, the New York Times had that good story talking to people in Kenosha, saying, again, sounding like that kind of that imaginary Trump voter I was just channeling there a second ago, being like, Donald Trump is not a guy I like in a lot of ways. However, I do not trust the Democratic Party to do what is necessary to stop the riots, to stop the protests. The right-wing party is always the law and order party. Law and order is going to, the White House has bet their entire election chances, it seems, on this law and order messaging. There is some polling data to back up the idea that this is, particularly in the suburbs, this is something that's causing turbulence for Joe Biden, that this is causing problems, this is creating headwinds for the Democrats. We have seen some of that data, while at the same time, to Jamie's point, nationally, all of the polls look very good for for Joe Biden. If you're a betting man, Joe Biden is seems more likely to win the election than Donald Trump. But yeah, it's going to be an issue if the protests, particularly violent protests, continue to spread. That's an X factor in this election that I don't think any of us really know how that's going to play out, who it's really going to hurt. But yeah, there's certainly an argument to be made that Democrats should be very nervous about an increase in lawlessness and an increase in crime that we're seeing in some major cities. There's a certain subsection of even progressive voters that consider themselves very liberal, but crime goes up one iota and they might switch,
Yeah.
or they might
What's
stay
what's the
home,
old
or they may go Green Party.
what's the old line? A conservative is a liberal who's been mugged.
A mug
So
by reality. That's the old critical line. Yeah.
Um, I
so
Go ahead.
yeah. What do you think, Jamie?
Well, look, I agree with Will that we don't know which way it's going to help. I guess I tend to agree with you, Matt. Probably that it could hurt Joe Biden. But here's the thing: for the health of the country, you need Democrats primarily need them more than any other thing condemning the violence on their side, Antifa, and you need Republicans primarily condemning the violence that's coming from the right, or even if it's not violence, which it is sometimes, but instigation. When Trump was telling people to go into Portland, I mean, that can't be good, even if legally they're allowed to go there and promote whatever cause they want. Sending in a rival protest to a violent protest is not good. Things aren't going to come from that. But what we need is both sides to condemn the fringes of their own side for the health of our society, much less the election. I mean, I'm really worried, very worried, that the incentives in the media, in cable news and in politics, doesn't allow for that. And if you watch cable news every night, I'm not seeing any evidence that people are willing to condemn their own ideological side. And until that happens, I think we're at real risk for more combustion in the United States. And what worries me the most is the threats of the election night. You might have it look like Donald Trump's going to win, but when mail-in ballots are counted over the weeks, it's going to go decisively to Joe Biden. There's no trust right now in any institutions that the other side's going to accept such a turn of events. And you really need both parties working to make sure that trust is there, that whoever gets the most votes, whether it's on election night or maybe decided afterwards, we can trust and will trust, and both sides will come together. I don't see any evidence that both sides are working to try to make a peaceful outcome. In fact, I see the opposite.
I completely agree. I share your concerns. Scary as hell. So instead of dwelling there, I want to move on to some wildly premature rank punditry. And we are uniquely qualified, the three of us, to have this discussion, which is about Tucker Carlson, where we all three worked for Tucker at the Daily Caller. I was there for 6 years. You guys might have been there longer. So I think we are well prepared to talk about Tucker Carlson. There is, of course, speculation that in 2024 he might run for president. And what I would love from each of you is your take on whether, what are the odds he will run? And then based on your knowledge of him, we'll put Tucker on the couch. Why? Why do you think he will or he won't? I'll start with you, Will Rahn. Does Tucker run in 2024?
I have no idea if Tucker Carlson runs for president in 2024. I do assume that if he were here talking with us, he would say that there is a 0% chance that he would run, that there's absolutely off the table, that he would never consider it. And right now, there's no reason to think otherwise, other than the fact that if Tucker Carlson were to run for president in 2024, he could win. I think you never. Again, it's 4 years out. We have no idea what 2024 is going to look like. But what Tucker is able to do in terms of getting straight to the heart of what a lot of the Republican rank and file think and care about, and getting ahead of issues, of seeing farther than a lot of conservative commentators, a lot of liberal commentators, and a lot of politicians. I think he probably has a better understanding of the Republican base than a lot of the Republican politicians that we suspect or expect are going to run in 2024. We've seen, just to quickly kind of run down, there's a few people who start to look like people who just have their eye on the White House. Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, doesn't seem like he's not really hiding anything. He's going to New Hampshire. He's someone who is widely understood to have presidential ambitions. You have perhaps Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri. You have Nikki Haley. You have Kristi Noem in South Dakota. It's probably going to be one of these things. I think maybe for the rest of our lives, we're just going to have these gigantic fields, and basically everybody who can run for president on the Republican side will run for president on the Republican side. It's very hard to game all of this out because we have no idea what 2024 is going to look like, particularly if it's, as the Republicans say, Joe Biden's America at that point. But, it's true. We all worked at the Daily Caller, kind of a previous iteration of the Daily Caller. I think it was a different website at the time. And alums from the Daily Caller have spread out throughout all these different places in the media at this point. But we do all know Tucker, and I think none of us would want to be on a debate stage against him. Tucker's a very smart guy, and
I kind of would enjoy it. I disagree.
But verbally, I mean, this is a guy who knows how to throw punches verbally, and I could imagine a scenario in some distant universe where Tucker Carlson is up there and just wipes the floor with the Republican competition before Republican voters even figure out which one is Josh Hawley and which one is Tom Cotton.
Yeah. So I have a slightly different take than Will on some of this. So I've asked Tucker on the record on my podcast, and he says, as Will said, 0% chance. I have never heard anything different, and I wouldn't if he secretly told me. I wouldn't reveal it here. He hasn't. I'll give you two things that one reason why I think he might run, and one reason why I think he wouldn't run. And one reason why he might run is that he always likes to say, always do the most interesting opportunity available. I think he would have fun running for president. I think it would be.
This is advice for those who don't know. This is advice he would give interns when we would have our mentoring time, and he would speak to the interns. His biggest piece of advice was like, if you're facing a decision, do take the most interesting option, right?
Yeah, so I think that is a case for him running. What an interesting life journey that would be from TV to running for president. The reason why I think he might not is obviously that protest that was at his house a couple of years ago in D.C. I don't know if he'd want to subject his family to the type of bitterness. I mean, he's already has some of that on TV, but it gets ramped up, and I'm not sure that type of thing is something that anyone would relish, including Tucker. So I have no idea whether he runs. I do question a little bit Will's analysis that he understands the Republican base better than anybody. I don't know if anybody understands the Republican base. The Republican base was one thing, in my opinion, until Donald Trump came along and kind of helped shift them to a different way of thinking through a force of personality. I think Tucker has similar credentials in the sense that he is like Donald Trump was, an expert of media, an expert of TV. So I think he has an ability to, on the debate stage, wipe the floor, at least in the way image-wise with his rivals, just like Trump did. But I don't know what the Republican base, if you could say there is a conservative movement that means much when it rapidly goes from Tea Party cutting budgets to within a few years, budgets don't matter. I think it really matters of who what personality they like the most and where that personality leads them. So that's my 2 cents.
All right, I want to close with some somewhat personal questions, and I'll start with Will Rahn. I think you're in New York City.
Yes.
What's it like in New York City these days?
My just sort of like firsthand view. It does appear like the city is coming back. People walk around, everybody's in masks, but there's this kind of Parisian quality to the city now that people have talked about because the restaurants now, people sit outside. They've taken up pieces of the sidewalk. And you walk by some restaurants that never seemed particularly full in the past. Now that they have this outdoor seating, they have tons of people there. And this is just purely anecdotal, but I'm trying to be hopeful about the city that I love. Now, I know there's been a certain amount of snarky tweeting from people on the left saying, I'm walking around New York City and everything is absolutely fine. I don't understand why people are talking about crime or anything like that. But you look at this from a statistical standpoint, it is a worrying time in New York City for a bunch of different reasons. We saw that blog post that made a lot of news from that guy who runs the comedy club. And he made some interesting points in there about how bandwidth has increased to the extent that people can live wherever. And what is the point? All of these companies are going to figure out, why do we pay these massive rents on having these massive New York office buildings? There are real estate issues. There's tax base issues. If the tax base flees to the suburbs and the city has to cut back on services, and that leads to more increase in crime, and then more of the tax base flees. These kind of death cycles have happened before. And we are seeing an uptick in crime right now. That's undebatable. All I can say is, after this presidential election in 2021, New York City is going to be picking its next mayor. And that's going to be an extraordinarily important election, not only for the city, but for this country.
And Will, do you have any Matt Lewis memories or stories that you would want to share that will not get me fired or divorced or canceled?
Is this a question you ask everyone? Is this like your Hugh Hewitt, was Aldrich a communist spy?
Have you read The Looming Tower, Will?
I have read The Looming Tower, yes. But let's see, a Matt Lewis memory. A few come to mind, Matt. You've told some good jokes over the years, but this is family friendly program.
All right.
So let's not.
We'll save that.
Let's not.
We'll save that for the exclusive Patreon only.
Yeah, for your only fans, for Matt Lewis After Dark.
Which, by the way, you can be an only fan, so to speak, if you go to patreon.com/Matt Lewis. Jamie Weinstein, I've got a couple questions for you. One, I don't think you've been on the show since you became a father, and I'd love to hear your take on being a dad and how that's changed you and your life, and also your podcast, which is awesome, is coming back. You've got two really good guests lined up. I'd love to hear both or either about fatherhood and the podcast.
Wow, have I really not been on the podcast since fatherhood? That is amazing, if true.
I think I've been on your podcast, but I don't think you've been on since Harry was born.
Well, it's been a wonderful experience. It's the greatest experience of my life, without question. He brings joy every day, so I highly, highly recommend going out and becoming a father, preferably to someone you're married to. But I guess not. I guess that's not required. So it's been a wonderful experience. Yes, I took a little bit of a few months sabbatical from the podcast. It is back. We had Tim Miller on this week. John Bolton will be on next week. I already recorded that interview. And then I'll be recording next week for the following week with another episode with Brian Stelter. on CNN. So we have a good group of guests coming on, and I hope your listeners will come and enjoy my show too.
Yeah, anyone who listens to this show should listen to the Jamie Weinstein podcast, because if you like this, you'll love that. And by the way, we're going to be fighting over the same guest. I'm trying to book Brian Stelter right now, as coincidence would have it. So we'll see who lands him first. Jamie, do you have any Matt memories or stories that will not get me fired or canceled or divorced that you would like to share?
Well, I have a lot of stories. I do one that I think fondly of, just because of the moment we're in, is that my last dinner with friends in Washington before the epidemic or the pandemic was, if you remember, my wife and I went out with you and Aaron, and we went to a French restaurant in Georgetown, and then went to a nice hotel for drinks. And we didn't really know that the world was going to shut down basically completely for a long period of time. But it did. But it was nice that our last dinner with friends before that was with you and your wife.
Oh, that's right.
That's quite a memory. That's one for the memoir, Jamie.
That is a good memory. I don't know. What yeah. It's certainly a better memory than the one that you provided, I think.
No, it is actually. I think everybody has that last dinner story now, and it's just going to be something to look back on, certainly.
Forever.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, I remember thinking of it as being like the feeling of like the night before a snowstorm. The weather reports tell you you're going to get a foot of snow tomorrow, and you go out. And you think you might be holed up for a couple days. And that's what it felt like. It's been like 6 months, I guess. So,
Matt, if we have time, I have some Will Rahn Las Vegas stories to share if we have time. Okay, it seems like maybe we don't.
All right. Well, you get those. Go to patreon.com/Matt Lewis, and I'll have. If there's a clamoring for this, we'll have Will Rahn and Jamie Weinstein on for a Matt Lewis After Dark story time.
Yeah, I think you should absolutely do that. That should be your first OnlyFans.
Yeah.
In the meantime, check out the Jamie Weinstein Show podcast. Will, do you have anything you would like to promote?
Oh, there's this website called Yahoo News. It's one of the largest news websites on the planet. And if you don't read it, why don't you check it out and see what all of the commotion is about?
Love it. Check out Yahoo News. Check out the Jamie Weinstein Show. Will Rahn and Jamie Weinstein, thank you both for coming back on the news.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.